Hopefully not. Yeah, so it says we're live. Let's just wait for it to go on YouTube. Yeah, I think we're live.
Ok.
Pretty sure. Então, boa tarde, gente. Boa tarde a todo mundo. A gente está muito feliz de estar aqui para o segundo dia do evento sobre Walter Scott, recebendo uma professora maravilhosa, professora Kathryn Sutherland. We're very, very honored to have you here, Professor Sutherland. Thank you so much. And today we also have Professor Thiago Cas again, who will do us the honor of chatting to her about her presentation. And later on, we can all just have a conversation about her talk. And, só um informativo para quem quiser o certificado, para quem, né, estiver procurando isso. Eu vou deixar, o Lero vai deixar nos comentários o link para o Google Forms, vocês têm que preencher esse formulário e aí enviar um e-mail para lero@usp.br solicitando a confirmação de que você assistiu esse evento. E é isso, eu tenho paciência, porque quem vai fazer isso sou eu, no caso, uma pessoa. Então, fé que uma hora o certificado chega. And that's all. Let's all have a great afternoon discussing amazing literature with amazing people, and the floor is all yours, professors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beatrix. Well, I would like to welcome everyone to the second day of our conference series on Walter Scott. And I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Kathryn Sutherland. And on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome you, albeit digitally, to the University of São Paulo. Professor Kathryn Sutherland is Professor of English Literature and Senior Research Fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford. Her research interests include Romantic period British literature, the Scottish Enlightenment, Scottish literature more generally, and modern manuscript studies. Her books include Jane Austen's Textual Lives, From Aeschylus to Bollywood, Transferred Illusions, Digital Technology and the Forms of Print, Jane Austen's fiction manuscripts, and she has edited Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and several of Walter Scott's novels, Red Gauntlet, The Bride of Lammermoor, and Waverley. Her latest book, Why Modern Manuscripts Matter, will appear early in 2022. It includes a chapter on Walter Scott, and the title of her conference will be Brushed Against the Grain, Waverley, History and Fiction After Waverley. So I would like to emphasize, Professor Sutherland, it's a great honor to be with you, to welcome you this afternoon and to hear you talk about your research. The floor is entirely yours, and I'll move to the backstage. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Thiago, for such a lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to hear me. Thank you for inviting me to speak today and to travel to Brazil via the magic carpet of digital technology. When Beatrice asked me to talk, she set me a challenge. She asked me to associate Scott with recent women writers and their engagement with history. And that's what I've tried to do. So I hope you enjoy it. In July 1814, when Waverley was published, Scott's subtitle, "'Tis 60 Years Since," was a slight of history, resolved if unexplained in the opening chapter by the narrator's comment that he writes 60 years before this present 1st of November, 1805. By 1814, and the restored moment of writing, the events with which the life of the fictional Edward Waverley enmesh, the Jacobite uprising of 1745-6, had taken place almost 70, not 60 years since. But 60 years before this present 1st of November 1805 takes the historically alert reader back to the auspicious date of the 1st of November 1745, when Prince Charles Edward Stuart marched his army south from Edinburgh on its campaign into England. If the miscalculation is nothing more than a failure to refresh a detail when the novel was taken up after a gap of almost 10 years, it also usefully points up, as does the concluding postscript, which should have been a preface, a question that underlies all historical novels, a question of the historical moment, of when history was or is. It matters where we are in history. It matters to what is written and to how we read it. It can make narratives turn out otherwise. Scott's two quizzical distortions, the opening misdating and the seemingly misplaced preface, bring into play the possibility that, like narrative and its writing, events too may not have a proper place. Their chronology of before and after might be disputed. Specifically, I want to consider here what is the moment that we might think of as the historical event within the historical novel, and how, as readers caught in our own historical moments in 2021, we might reconnect to Scott's contribution to historical consciousness as worked through a fiction. Could I have the next slide, please, Beatrice? In Europe, at least, 2021 seems an auspicious moment to do this. Not only are we living through a resurgence of the historical novel and renewed recognition of its literary significance, but that resurgence is shaped by two categories previously excluded from serious regard within the genre. One is the counterfactual history, something South American writers caught on to much sooner than we Europeans, and the other is the woman writer. The French writer, Laurent Binet's latest novel, Civilizations, 2019, turns history on its head, describing through a series of seeming primary sources a mirror world in which the Vikings discover America, Christopher Columbus never makes it back to Spain, Cervantes is exiled to Cuba, and the Inca king Atahualpa invades Europe. Binet uses the documents that his manufactured history leaves behind to ask questions about history in general, about power and the systems that underlie it. Among women writers in Britain, Pat Barker in The Silence of the Girls, 2018, breaks the conventional distinction between history and myth to allow women a voice. History is then, she comments, myth is now. Helen Dunmore in The Siege, 2001, and in subsequent novels like Birdcage Walk, her last novel in 2017, examines how private life is shaped by the political events that constitute history, and yet remains invisible to it. Invisible because in recounting the siege of Leningrad in September 1941, Dunmore reconstructs with startling intimacy a range of ordinary experience that too often escapes the representative and filtered gaze of both historical and fictional consciousness. She has a central cast of characters whose fortunes we follow, but their stories are cut across by micro-histories of extraordinary vividness. And Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy of 2009 to 2020 dares to enter and inhabit the consciousness of a public figure as though he were a palpable fiction. Could I have the next slide, please? I've no idea whether Camilla Shamsi has read any Scott, but like Waverley, her 2017 novel, Home Fire, concerns a troubled bloodline across the generations, clashes within families between belief systems and civic obligation. Home Fire explores how families intersect with politics and cultural identity, and the consequences for the security of the individual, caught, in this instance, between Britishness and Muslim faith. It's also a contemporary reimagining of Sophocles' Antigone, at whose centre lies the story of two sisters' response to the legal repercussions of a brother's act of treason. Structured around 5 characters and 5 viewpoints, the novel falls into 5 sections, like a 5-act play, and is set in 5 locations: London, Amherst, Massachusetts, Istanbul, Raqqa, and Karachi. The teenage Anika must choose between betraying the law of the land of Britain or betraying her conscience, call that her blood loyalty, when she risks her life to bury her dead brother, branded a traitor. Which law is more compelling? Shamsi's narrative, especially in its latter stages, follows closely the arc of Antigone's. The outcome of her civil disobedience is tragedy. Waverley, as we know, though a traitor to country and family, is given a second chance. Barker, Dunmore, Mantell, and Shamsi all break the tacitly acknowledged rules of serious historical fiction by writing as women, and they each reassess what the genre might do. In thinking about their diverse challenges to historical accounting, I'm especially interested in how the revisionist reading of myth, as worked into history by Barker and Shamsi, might contribute to recent renewed debate about Scott's historical model. Scott's subject for fiction is always history, how large-scale historical events and processes help determine how individuals work out their destinies. And Scotland's Stuart past provided a particular lens. Early and late, Stuart, and especially Jacobite history, was an essential thread in Scott's imagination, a test of the strength of imagination rather than of politics, an imagination that is saturated in history as a set of explanations as much as events. History as stories which are self-serving, partial, and fertilely contradictory. Much recent criticism of Scott has focused on the work done by his novels in defining and delimiting cultural Scottishness over the last 200 years. Specifically, does Scott use history to displace history, replacing it with a kind of theatrical illusion or invented past, like the infamous painting commissioned by Waverley at the novel's close to record his Highland adventures, a kind of consensual fiction around which we form an imagined community, history packaged as authenticity effects or heritage? Is Scott by this the literary arm of a progressive and colonising British state, with Scotland its first victim, trapped inside a false version of its past? Or does Scott expose as deceptive the idea that culture can be detached from politics in rendering it usable in the present? Does his sedimentary writing style, piling written sources and erudite annotation upon the distressed oral genres of legend and ballad, challenge history's forgetting, even as it inscribes it? However we argue it, might we agree that Scott's concern is the condition of modernity, how we got to be modern? That's the thesis and antithesis underlying persuasive arguments and counter-arguments offered over the last decade by Ian Duncan, Cairns Craig, Andrew Lincoln, and Caroline McCracken Flesher, among others. What sustains their readings is Scott's multi-voiced placement of events, the density of his historical system building, apparently time-proofing his insights and overlaying them with the resilient irony that there are, after all, few uncontentious facts in history, that history waits to be discovered in the moment of reading. In her 2017 Reith Lectures, in England, Reith Lectures are a prestigious series of public talks named in honour of John Reith, the BBC's first Director General. And in her 2017 lectures, Hilary Mantel, herself greeted in the British newspaper The Guardian as redefining what the historical novel is capable of and giving it muscle and sinew. Mantel described the job of the historical novelist as putting the reader in the moment. But which is the moment, and whose is the moment? Scott combines in his historical fiction two Enlightenment interests under pressure from his modern moment of 1814, an interest in history as a collective and public narrative of human progress, the discourses of economic means and cultural mentalities, as argued by Edinburgh's 18th century sociological historians, and an interest in history as private narrative, Bildungsroman, a European genre also emerging from the late 18th century. The one operates at the societal level, the other suggests the possibility of individual moral and spiritual growth. As Scott shows in Waverley, the two may share a teleology, social and personal history as the march towards improvement, but they don't necessarily operate in step. Waverley, the wavering hero, is doubly constructed. Caught up in public conflict, his personal history remains stubbornly constituted as romance, events aestheticized, packaged and reinvented, even in the moment of experience. It's as if he's always absorbing at second hand what happens around him. There's a wonderful image of this in chapter 42 of the novel, when he first puts on Highland dress, he puts on trews and the Makiva tartan, and he does so in front of a mirror. What opens in the course of the novel's development is a disjuncture between the historical present, the events of 45, and the character who only appears to mediate them. Slide 4, please, the next one. Georg Lukács, whose classic study, the historical novel, was translated into English 60 years since, in 1962, described Scott's historical time of writing, the events of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, as for the first time making history a mass experience, and moreover on a European scale. And he writes, during the decades between 1789 and 1814, each nation of Europe underwent more upheavals than they had previously experienced in centuries. And the quick succession of these upheavals gives them a qualitatively distinct character. It makes their historical character far more visible than would be the case in isolated individual instances. What distinguished the post-revolution world was, according to Lukács, an increasing consciousness of the historical character of development. History was in contention in the period. Its development as a liberal meta-narrative of enlightenment and progress, unsettled by evidence of the lived consequences of its present disruptive unfolding, narrative challenged by events. One of the signature anxieties of the emergent world was dispossession, a sense of estrangement from even the relatively recent past. Ina Ferris has written of an alertness in romantic historical fiction to what we might call the time lag, a suspension of connection and continuity that generates a curiously insubstantial existence in the present. The soldier, the refugee, the exile, figures dislocated in time and space haunt the romantic text. So too the ruin. We might extend this to a persistent romantic equation of time, time passing and time past and time to come, with rupture. Waverley is a man of his 1814 moment, dislocated from the start. As the useful novelistic device of the stranger who needs to be told, he too is profoundly estranged. For him, the historical present filtered through romance is already past. At the same time, the reader learns, as Waverley doesn't, what is lost despite the sturdiness of its romantic packaging. A world lies in ruins around Waverley. Its dispossession, the price for his possession. He chooses not to see this. Can readers in the 21st century make this same choice? Next slide, please. "60 years since, Alexander Welsh and Donald Davie, critics in the Anglo-American liberal tradition, saw in Waverley the first of Scott's passive heroes, a Regency gent whose reality and morality belong firmly to the early 19th century and our modern world. For Donald Davie, in the heyday of Sir Walter Scott of 1961, Waverley in 1745 is the man of the future and a person we are meant on the whole to respect. For Welsh, as the representatives of modern civil society, a society rooted in property law, all Scott's protagonists, even where there is no question of a journey to the Highlands, must undertake a carefully guarded excursion to see how the other half perishes. The other half being those who sit on the wrong side of history by not endorsing a particular view of property. Property is invested in the proper hero, for whom real estate, land, confirms both reality and the future, the safe domestic space at the end of history, Waverley's Dulce Domum. And both Welsh and Davie endorse, 60 years since, Scott's project to harness the life in history to the great realist tradition of the 19th century novel, to George Eliot, Dickens and Balzac, and realism's abiding concern with the adequacy of society to fulfill the deepest needs of the individual. By this, we follow Waverley as he wakes out of one dream, call it the nightmare of public events, into another, the illusion of self-possession. And yet Scott is far too good a historian not to be ambivalent about the ways and means of the individual life, the character who comes into his possessions as others are dispossessed. Has there ever been a moment of reading when the reader was fully complicit in Waverley's self-deluded progress? If Donald Davie's person we are meant on the whole to respect ever did exist, it seems in 2021 an especially difficult challenge to resurrect him. Waverley is a man who is radicalized, switches sides twice in civil war, and has the blood on his hands of the private soldiers who enlisted with him and whom he betrays. He's a man who is magically extricated from charges of desertion and incitement to mutiny, and who suffers none of the guilt or trauma of the soldier survivor. In working the protagonist into his narrative, Scott took the historical novel in a different direction from Hilary Mantel, where she breaks the rules to give fictional depth, the secret life of consciousness, though not mediating interiority to Thomas Cromwell, a real historical character. Scott creates from his fictional hero something opaque, lacking in definition. Scott's hero matters less. We enjoy Mantel because she transposes to the historical novel the standout character of the now outmoded realist novel. Her historical project, the rehabilitation of a real historical figure, draws strength from a kind of generic nostalgia. We inhabit a society through Cromwell's eyes, even as he remains unreadable. Scott, by contrast, quizzes the way our reading lives map onto Waverley's. He asks us to question any easy complicity. Not only is Waverley's character insipid and acted upon by the spur of circumstances, those are both verdicts of the anonymous review of his novel that Scott himself co-authored in 1817. So that's in fact what Scott himself says about his hero, that he is insipid and acted upon by the spur of circumstance. His role as historical tourist, the reader's mediator in the past, is absurd or distasteful and regularly exposed as inauthentic. Next slide, please. Heading north after Culloden, in disguise as Talbot's nephew, Frank Stanley, Waverley passes the day with the real Stanley, a Cambridge student, whom he entertains with stories of his campaigns and the manners of the Highlands, whistling a pibroch, dancing a strathspey, and singing a Highland song. Only a few paragraphs later, he stands before the ruined Tullyveerlan and the signs of wanton destruction caused by government forces. The heading for the chapter is Desolation. Waverley fails, as we, the reader, cannot, to register this disjuncture. The narrator's persistent use of the descriptor, our hero, is heavy with irony. At critical moments, Waverley sprains his ankle, falls sick, is carried like a baby, and sent like a parcel to Charles Edward's headquarters in Holyrood Palace. In a late piece of grotesquerie, it's Fergus McKeever who supports Edward by the arm as Fergus walks to his execution. Caught up in and carried along by events, in many cases literally carried, Waverley is just as easily set free from their consequences. The close matching of aesthetic form and psychology that assumes the importance of the one life is missing. And yet, inadequate though his accounting is, the narrative rarely leaves Waverley's side. If the accommodation of public to private history is false, the outward turn also appears sacrificed as the last chapter, entitled a Postscript, which should have been a preface, accelerates the reader into a present time of writing, when the narrator tells us Scotland as little resembles what it was 60 years before as England resembles its Elizabethan self. Like the novel, history draws to a close. And the narrator corroborates his statement history-wise for those interested to follow it up, with an external source remarking that the political and economic effects of these changes have been traced by Lord Selkirk. Only two historical figures appear inside the novel, Charles Edward Stuart and Colonel Gardiner, Waverley's commanding officer in the Hanoverian army, designated as Colonel G in the 1814 edition. Conversely, Scott is keen to name his sources, printed and oral, to reveal the historical underpinning of his fiction. He owned and used for the novel a large collection of Jacobite books and pamphlets, and he had a first-hand supply of anecdotes from those who had fought in the campaign. The name of Thomas Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, however, risks upsetting the settlement fiction makes with the past in these closing pages. Selkirk's book, to which Scott refers the reader, Observations on the Present State of the Highlands of Scotland with a View of the Causes and Probable Consequences of Emigration, was published in 1805, exactly 60 years since the Jacobite uprising and its suppression. Like Scott, Selkirk was a lowlander, his fellow law student at Edinburgh University. Like Scott, but even more like Waverley, he had a romantic enthusiasm for the Scottish North. Beginning in 1792, in his early 20s, Selkirk travelled extensively in the Highlands, learning Gaelic and inquiring into the management policies of clan chiefs, busy reinventing themselves as commercial landowners after the 45, and replacing centuries-old communities and allegiances by sheep. The next slide, please. Selkirk writes in the opening pages of the Observations, and you see how like it is, how like Waverley. Without any immediate or local connection with the Highlands, I was led very early in life to take a warm interest in the fate of my countrymen in that part of the kingdom. My curiosity was strongly excited by the representations I'd heard of the ancient state of society and the striking peculiarity of manners still remaining among them. And in the year 1792, I was prompted to take an extensive tour through their wild region. In 1813 to 14, at the time of the publication of Waverley, and as the Highland clearances were widely canvassed in the London newspapers, Selkirk was outspoken on the injustice of the progressive thinking that underpinned the removal of people from the land. Next slide, please. His considerable effort to understand the mentality of the anti-clearance protesters in Sutherland, in Scotland's far northeast, was already in 1805 written across the observations. In particular, his sympathy with an ancestral attitude to land ownership and maintenance that the modernizing clan chiefs now disputed. And he writes, "It's often happened that 30 or 40 families have been dispossessed all at once to make way for a great sheep farm. The country affords no means of living without a possession of land. And how is that to be procured? The farms that are not already in the hands of the graziers are all full of inhabitants, themselves perhaps in dread of the same fate." If in 1814 the absorption of the bellicose Highlander inside Britain's modern army signalled triumphant assimilation, his guerrilla tactics deployed to effect against Napoleon in the Peninsular Campaign, projects for the systematic depopulation of northern Scotland suggest that history comes to an end by other means, as the land is emptied of human lives. Triumphalism is, however briefly, at risk from despair in the post-historical mood of Scott's final chapter. Though in the closing pages the narrator appears as eager as Waverley to compress time, hustling events 60 years since out of history and into romance, the postscript, which should have been a preface, opens the possibility of beginning the story again, and this time with a better informed Edward Waverley. Where Waverley steps too easily out of history into his kitschly accoutred mirror self, Selkirk's observations threaten to introduce history as a different set of consequences. In Selkirk's account, the defeat of the Jacobite campaign of 45 segues into its political and economic effects, the eradication of dress, custom, language, and a relationship to the land, the disappearance of people from the land. In 1814, to those Highlanders cleared from the good lands of Strathsbrora and Kildonan, down to the infertile soil of Sutherland's northeast coast, a fresh start in Canada seemed more appealing. History never comes to an end. Each action has consequences, including Selkirk's. His campaign to settle emigrant Highland crofters on land along Manitoba's Red River led to armed resistance from the local Métis peoples, who, in opposing Selkirk's colonizing ambitions, formed from their mixed Indigenous and European heritage a shared identity, self-possession rather than dispossession. Where narrative form cloaks history, history opens the novel to question, to reading against its grain. The grain of fiction works to convert the many into the one, which is why the solitary reader receives such a jolt when the narrator of George Eliot's Middlemarch interrupts herself by saying, "Dorothea, but why always Dorothea?" That's in chapter 29. We're well into the novel and we think it's a novel about Dorothea, but maybe it isn't. Our immediate reaction is, but who else matters? By contrast, Scott quickly disabuses the reader that Waverley matters. Waverley is a flawed guide. The history the narrative proposes is never adequately expressed through his mental and emotional processes. His self-regard resists historical insight, and unlike Dorothea Brooke, he is never held sufficiently to account to embody a sense of life lived in the midst of uncontrollable events. Hence, the impression he leaves is of emptiness rather than vulnerability. And despite our shared addiction to romance, we're not invited to see in his fallibility, as we are in, say, David Copperfield's, our shared humanity. There's something touchingly human in David's failure to make the right decisions. Though Waverley, at the end, history proofs himself, the novel cannot. If fiction is a challenge to history, history is a challenge to the novel. The discursive dissonance of the authorities for Waverley, the novel's mixing of printed and oral sources, its random Gallic tags, snatches of song and curious antiquarian lore, and its gestures to professional history, resolutely refuse assimilation to a single view or voice upon the past. The satiric distance imposed between the narrator and the pedantry of his antiquarian other, the Baron of Bradwardine, like that imposed upon Waverley's romancing, ensures, though at greater risk of exhausting the reader's patience, that we hear disparate kinds and accounts of experience. Whose story and how many stories will history tell? The nation, like history, is an embodied argument, different voices and points of view. Agreement is fragile, and the stories that bind us perpetuated in the teeth of the evidence. The challenge was keen in 1814 when, after decades of European and worldwide war, the redrawing of national boundaries and displacement of peoples, history became a mass experience. Literature is good at distilling the many into the one, making the public personal and private, and therefore universal. But how might it make the many count and still be many, indivisible by one? Next slide, please. Though the discipline and efficiency of the regular Hanoverian army is noted, the only multitude or collective the reader encounters in the course of Waverley is that of the interests that constitute the Jacobite cause, and their social adhesion is regularly problematized. Fergus McKeever, though a Highland chief, is a Frenchified Scotchman. Charles Edward Stuart is an Italian knight-errant. The lowland Jacobite, the Baron of Bradwardine, has travelled in Holland, dresses like a Frenchman, and looks like a Swiss guard. As for the clansmen, the Highlanders, their wild character and appearance and uncouth language, elsewhere called gibberish, conveyed even to their near neighbours, the lowland Scots, as much surprise as if an invasion of African Negroes or Eskimo Indians had issued forth from the northern mountains of their own native country. The narrator here appears to echo another contemporary work, John Pinkerton's dissertation on the origin and progress of the Scythians or Goths of 1787, where the Celtic peoples are described as the aborigines of Europe in retreat to the fringes of civilization, among which northern Scotland, as they are displaced by the superior race of Anglo-Saxon Teutonic peoples. Heterogeneously European, a clash of cultural mentalities requiring comparative anthropological understanding, the Jacobite army easily breaks into factions that turn one against another. They are many by virtue of their disunity. Significantly too, they inhabit multiple and irreconcilable timeframes. The gibbering indigenous Gaels occupying time's deepest sedimentary layer. Elsewhere, embedded literary allusions associate the Jacobite army with Satan's troop of fallen angels, as depicted in Milton's Paradise Lost. Next slide, please. In Scott's view, of history repeated across several novels, nations are founded in civil war and bound together in the face of continuing or potential conflict. Milton's poem and its moment of composition after the English Civil War and in the first years of the Stuart Restoration, the 1660s, carry a particular freight. There can be no simple alignment of the fallen angels with the Jacobite cause, but the elegiac burden of Milton's treatment of the war against heaven resonates through the novel. As early as the Stag Hunt, reference is made to the futile debates of the angels in hell, as the gathered clans engage in discussion of politics and news. Sleeping before the Battle of Preston Pans, the Jacobite forces appear stretched upon the ridge of the hill, thick as leaves in Vallombrosa. An image from Book 1 of Paradise Lost, used there to describe the newly fallen angels, rebels against God government, it opens up worlds of reference. Vallombrosa is the shady valley of Etruria, home of the Etruscans, an ancient people eclipsed by the Romans, as told in the Aeneid. Fallen leaves are an enduring figure for the numberless dead in battle, as in the Iliad, where, as is the generation of leaves, so is that of humanity. The image belongs to the narrator's literary repertoire, not his heroes, and it works effectively to assemble history's many as witnesses to the solitary reader's sentimental education, what we each know through and as literature, allusion that edges historical circumstance, the thing that happens over and over, into fatalism. In the course of nature, the fallen leaf is replaced by the bud, but in the Highlands post-45, change would be cataclysmic and traumatic. Post-45, statistical enquiry, specifically Sir John Sinclair's 29-volume statistical account of Scotland, published between 1791 and 1799, designated the Highlands overpopulated and its people a drain on the new British state. Leaves that fell would not renew. Like the historical novel, political economy is among the great discursive innovations of the end of the 18th century. Romantic formulations, the historical novel and statistics are both haunted by the spectre of populousness, that the many are too many, and ways must be found to dematerialize the threat they pose. Both must find strategies to represent and yet control the many. Strategies in each case of dispossession, an evacuation of humanity, their humanity, the humanity of the other. Numbers neutralize people, rendering substance insubstantial. Literature discovers a fear of psychic crowding, that the self doesn't have sufficient room to grow, to possess itself unchallenged. Where political economy conceals people inside statistics, literature offers the image that enfolds echo inside echo, effective recurrence, accommodated to the circumstances of the solitary reader, diffusing the history that stalks the post-historic narrative and making it palatable. What we know now, and Waverley, the hero and the novel, did not, is that those whom history dispossesses are not the past, but history's vanguard. They represent the future. The refugee and the exile refuse the assimilation that history's narrative of progress demands. The spirited painting of McKeever and Waverley in Highland dress, with the clan descending in the background, which were shown at the end of the novel, is material evidence for the hero's self-delusion. But after Guernica, it cannot be ours. Painting, argued Picasso, is not made to decorate apartments. It's an offensive and defensive weapon. The dispossessed cannot be transformed into souvenirs, witnesses to our narrative and not theirs. Marginalized, cast out, mythologized, and buried in deep time, nonetheless they return, not as poetic types, but as urgent realities. Man is, of all species of luggage, the most difficult to be transported. Words from the great political economist Adam Smith, quoted by Selkirk in his Observations. Reading Waverley in 2021, when progressive ideologies and their economic underpinning have run out of steam, it's hard to defend or turn into elegiac poetry the evisceration of centuries-old communities. A low-impact economy whose people trod lightly on the land. The Highlands were overpopulous after the 45 only by the measure of improvement. Fertile land would yield higher returns when turned over to sheep. Indigenous peoples, notoriously work-shy, would work harder if given poor land to cultivate. Within decades of improvement, the fertile land was sterile, most of the people gone. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Indigenous peoples are in the front line of the climate emergency, declared a spokesperson at last week's COP26 in Glasgow. In a reappraisal of myth, the historical novelist Pat Barker writes, "The defeated go down in history and disappear, and their stories die with them. But history is then, myth is now." The silence of the girls, Barker's revisionist reading of the Iliad, through the voice of Briseis, Achilles' concubine, risks anachronism. Reviewers picked up on her Trojan character's use of terms like weekend and the old British monetary unit of half a crown. But her bold inversion of the time laws carries conviction. It's time, Barker argues, that the horrors suffered by women and children in war find a voice. While their stories continue to escape reportage in the history books, their lives relegated at most to a body count, we must dig deep to plant them inside the origin stories, the myths that express our shared humanity, and so bring them to light by other means. Barker uses myth to people the historical narrative as a way to recover alternative histories, to counter those narrative acts of dispossession that reinforce history as the property of the few, of those who are not defeated. The progress announced in the postscript that should have been a preface is in its place self-fulfilling when it replaces an older social description with its own model. But can the historical novel be insulated from a moment of reading when that model too has been discredited? How then do we read it? Scott's first novel describes how the past became the present time of private life in 1814. If its narrator doesn't share the complicity with his subject of the Austen narrator, he largely endorses Waverley's sentimental education as a model for the readers. Like Waverley, the narrative knows of Culloden only by report, and its brutal aftermath lies outside the story. Mass experience is too easily supplanted by the comforts of the individual life. If that misplaced preface risks intruding a different insight into how the past gave birth to the present, Selkirk's observations are all too swiftly displaced in their turn by the concluding dedication to Henry Mackenzie, author of The Man of Feeling. History is restored to its place inside our sentimental education. Unlike Selkirk, who made great efforts to understand the people as he found them, the consequences of history to the Highlanders of his own time held little interest for Scott. who with astonishing complacency told Lady Stafford that the recalcitrant tenants on her Sutherland estate would one day look back with gratitude to their mistress who pursued their welfare in spite of themselves. But we have the tools and the documents, some proffered by Scott himself, to read Waverley against its grain, to question the representative nature of individual experience and the sentimental requisitioning of other points of view, to curb our appetite for possession and the easy erasure of difference, to question what is done in the name of improvement, and to consider the ethics of tourism. Recent developments in the speculative historical novel extend the scope of the historicized past, finding in myth and the counterfactual a recuperative history and renewed respect for alterity. Time may be up for Waverley as representative modern man, but there's room for rereading Waverley the novel, though in some instances it will mean discovering that what it proposes as the solution was, after all, the problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sutherland. We lost Beatrix for a while. This is why she couldn't turn her slides.
Yes, I realised that. The last one had the quote from top 26.
we lost her. You know, she lost her connection, but she's back. Well, thank you for this very thought-provoking talk. I have taken many notes, and after Professor O'Malley's talk, I think we should just sort of arrange a sort of discussion and invite our viewers to join our discussion. Okay, so thank you very much for your conference, and I would like to call now Professor Seamus O'Malley, please. Hello, Professor O'Malley. First of all, I would like to we are sort of arranging this transnational and transoceanic conference, and
yeah, I'm
and
very sorry, Professor O'Malley.
And there was a sort of problem with the time zone. I think we thought that we didn't realize that actually that we thought that you were only 1 hour behind us, but actually you were too. I'm really sorry. We can't hear you. I can't hear you actually. I think your voice is rather robotic.
Can you hear me now?
You? Yeah.
It's good now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, at the time we made the arrangements for the conference, it was 2 hours, but now it's 1 because of daylight savings time, which is a very chaotic thing. So yeah.
I was just learning what happened here at our chat. Well, never mind. We have just made a sort of rearrangement of the conference order, but I would like to welcome. I would like to introduce the second conference that will be Modernist History versus Scott's Immersive Words, that will be delivered by Professor Seamus O'Malley, who is an assistant professor of English at Stern College for Women, Yeshiva University. His most recent publication, Making History New, Modernism and Historical Narrative, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. He has also published on authors such as W.B. Yeats, Ford Madox Ford, Robert Louis Stevenson, Alan Moore, and D.H. Lawrence. He specializes in themes such as 20th century British and Irish literature, and is currently writing a book on populism in Irish literature. Professor O'Malley, we are delighted to welcome you to São Paulo, albeit digitally, and we'll be. I'm very curious to hear your conference, and at the end of it, we shall open. We shall open to our viewers to intervene, and we shall to sort of rearrange a sort of discussion on both papers. Thank you very much, Professor O'Malley, for your presence.
Great, thanks. And can you see my slides right now?
Yeah, they're opening. Yes, they're perfect.
Great.
I can.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this lovely invitation. And yes, I also wish we could do this in person, but Zoom does allow all sorts of new and interesting connections, global connections. So my way of talking about Scott and modernist historical fiction today is going to be a bit of an unusual one. It is a video game from 1986, which not many of you might remember. It was called Defender of the Crown. And in the beginning of the game, you get to choose a character. As you can see from the top two characters, Wilfred of Ivanhoe and Cedric of Rotherwood, these two characters are, of course, based from Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, but not the bottom two characters, Geoffrey Longsword and Wulfric the Wild. These two characters are not in the novel. They are created for the game. You can only choose Saxons, and you square off against the Normans, including three characters from the novel, Brian de Bois-Guilbert, Philippe Malvoisin, and Reginald Front-de-Boeuf. Later, you can win the heart of Rebecca of York, as you see in the list of the ladies. But there's also three women listed here who are purely invented for the game. Is this then an adaptation of Ivanhoe? Interestingly, the plot is entirely new in the game. You go to see your friend Robin Hood, and it says here, during the journey, an assassin took the king's life. This is Richard de Lionheart. The kingdom is in chaos because there is no heir to the throne. So this is not the plot of Ivanhoe. This is maybe a sequel to Ivanhoe, as it's after the death of Richard, who was still alive and well at the end of Scott's novel. But if so, how is Reginald Front-de-Boeuf in the game? He dies in Ivanhoe. It doesn't make any plot sense. And in fact, Walter Scott's name does not appear in this game at all. And as a child, when I played this, I had no idea it was based on a novel, and it was only years later when I read Ivanhoe that I was like, wait, I've played this as a video game. Defender of the Crown, then, is neither an adaptation nor a sequel, and the game is less interested in the story, and it's more interested in the world that Scott produces. And I'd argue that this ability of these game makers to adopt Scott's fictional world indicates something about his approach to fiction and his approach to historical fiction. Scott might be a storyteller, but he's also a world maker or a world builder. And we can see this distinction between storytellers and world builders in what kind of texts video game makers are drawn to. It's not very often that a novel becomes a video game. Unsurprisingly, it's been genre writers like Tolkien or George R.R. Martin that end up as video games. But even this is a bit roundabout since they become movies and film and TV series first. Did you know that Dante's Inferno was recently a video game? Which makes a kind of sense. There's 9 levels. Each level gets harder as you go on. At the very end, you fight the big bad guy himself, Satan. So yeah, it does make a kind of, there's a kind of logic in adapting Dante's Inferno for a video game, although this is not how I pictured Beatrice. What Dante, Scott, and Tolkien all have in common is the ability to create or build worlds. This is a practice distinct from narrative storytelling, although often done in the same text. And so recently, kind of theorists have tried to make sense of these distinctions, and James G. Giovanna writes how world making is, in short, the creation of fictional worlds that is often performed in the creation of novels, stories, comic books, and visual art. But where narrative, painting, poetry, etc. are the main goal, the art form is only incidentally world making, or world making is a constitutive part of the art form. So what I think thinkers like Giovanna are trying to get at is what is the relationship between truth and the world created in the text? In most fiction, there are truths that we can verify or disprove internally within the world that is created. And so a useful example is The Tempest by Shakespeare, because he invents an island. It's a made-up island. It's not like Denmark or London, right? This is a made-up place. In The Tempest, Ariel tells Ferdinand, famously, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes." Meanwhile, in the same scene, Miranda says, "I have suffered with those that I saw suffer, a brave vessel who had, no doubt, some noble creature in her dashed all to pieces." The audience knows that Ariel is lying. This is false. This is a false statement. We can verify it within the play itself. We know that Alonso is actually alive and well walking around, whereas Miranda tells the truth because we have just witnessed the shipwreck that she describes. So internally, we could describe some statements as true and some statements as false within a work of fiction. Again, The Tempest takes place on an imaginary island, so we have to take on faith whatever the characters describe about it, and that's how Shakespeare builds the world. In Hamlet, by contrast, since it takes place in Denmark, there is a specific real-world reference embodied in the way that Hamlet works. Some of the world of Hamlet is told to us by the characters, but some of the play depends upon our knowledge of Denmark, the real place. For example, it's helpful to know it's near Norway, so when they talk about Norway, we can kind of understand how that works. This is all, I think, kind of obvious, right? But Di Giovanna asks is, in Hamlet, is there a boy named Lars playing marbles in Stockholm while Hamlet duels with Laertes? We can't say yes because there's no evidence for it in the play. No one says that there's a boy playing marbles outside. But we also can't say no because we haven't seen evidence that it's not happening. We can compare this to Ariel's song, which we know is false. So in fiction, like Hamlet or like most novels, there's some things we know to be true, some things we know are not true. But then there's some things which are just indefinite or indeterminate. For both Shakespeare and his audience, who cares, right? This is not crucial for the way we understand Hamlet. But Di Giovanna continues, those who engage in world making as an art form, seeing the world as an object of the art form, are inherently interested in the answer to virtually any question about their world. Whereas for those works of art, where world is an element, most potential questions are irrelevant, like Hamlet. So the world makers seek to make more complete worlds, often at the expense of narrative economy in works of fiction. Science fiction especially is riddled with these narrative inefficiencies. Often works of science fiction are formally uninteresting narratives because they're busy building worlds. It takes time to build these worlds. That's time not spent developing character or developing kind of narrative experimentation. World makers, in a sense, have to know if there's a boy named Lars playing marbles outside the castle. In video games, for example, while there are limits to where you can take your character, right, your avatar, within those limits, everything has to be thought out. If you go from here to there, this place here has to be built. Literary fiction, kind of just what we think of as most of the literary canon, has the least world building, or at least the least interesting world building, because they're assuming the world that the reader also assumes. If, let's say, Zadie Smith writes a new novel and it takes place in London, everything in the world of that novel is the same as our world, except for the fictional characters and the fictional plot that happens to them. Everything else in their world matches exactly what our world is. And of course, we can all have different worlds in our head, right? But that's I'm going to bracket that as a separate issue. In literary fiction, then, worlds are radically incomplete. In genre fiction, by contrast, they are more complete, although never, of course, fully complete. So the worlds of Scott's historical fiction is incomplete, yet is far more complete than most literary fiction, as I'll try to show in just a minute. It's in genre fiction, science fiction, and fantasy that we see modes of world making in their busiest, right, in action. Hence the adaptability of these generic texts to film and video games. Because one basic rule of these genres is the reliability and consistency of their rules. We don't have a problem with Superman flying. We just kind of take it as fine, right? We might have a problem, though, if he can read minds. If Harry Potter pulls out a lightsaber, we don't like that, right? Even though we're fine with these two things existing, magic and lightsabers existing in separate universes, we don't want to see them put together because they violate the internal laws of these worlds. So as the worlds are created, they have certain laws and protocols, and if we see them play out logically, we suspend our disbelief and we enjoy what we are watching. Because these created worlds are so thought out, they lend themselves to seriality. You can keep using them. Comic books, most obviously, you can just keep churning out month after month. The first person creates the world, subsequent writers and artists use it. Scott perfected seriality with the Waverley novels. In that sense, he does create this world in Waverley that he then gets to keep using. A lesser writer could pick up this world and at least produce a passable version of them using what Scott has already made. Defender of the Crown, then, the video game, is a serial, a kind of sequel, and is easily adaptable. You can keep making new versions. This is the 21st century version. Because what's striking about this game is how it's not adapting the plot of Ivanhoe, it's adapting the world of Ivanhoe. How then can we theorize world making when it's in our world, but historical, as we see in Scott's historical fiction? Because what I want to show today is that Scott's version of medieval history might as well be another world. He didn't write a sequel or a series to Ivanhoe the way he did with the Waverley novels, yet it's not hard to imagine him doing that, and that's partly what games like this are. Instead of continuity with Scott's present, which was partly the historical project of Waverley, and kind of like we've just seen in the previous talk, right? Ivanhoe stresses discontinuity, the remoteness of the age. As with the poetry of Tennyson or pre-Raphaelite paintings like we see here, their Middle Ages, the Victorian Middle Ages, are not about historical inquiries, but rather a fully imagined, fully realized world, which makes for easy escapism because of the discontinuity from our world. This is often, not always, but often the function of medievalism in the Victorian era. So how does Scott create a world? And especially I'm going to contrast this with the modernists, Ford Madox Ford and Virginia Woolf, because we could lump Scott in with the 19th century realists, right, and oppose him to the modernists, right? We think of Scott as a 19th century figure instead of just a romantic figure. But when we talk about realism in works of genre fiction, we, instead of referencing the real world, what we generally mean is something like coherence or consistency. So if Scott could be a realist in the way that the Harry Potter novels are a realist, I want to ask then, how does this realism function? So let's start with the opening chapter of Ivanhoe. It begins with a large historical perspective. And there's a few long quotes here just to start, so bear with me. To call this an omniscient narrator doesn't even do full justice. This isn't Trollope's omniscience. This is even more powerful as a vision. This narrator can see all of history. In that pleasant district of Merry England, which is watered by the River Don, there extended in ancient times a large forest, covering the greater part of the beautiful hills and valleys which lie between Sheffield and the pleasant town of Doncaster. The remains of this extensive wood are still to be seen at the noble seats of Wentworth, of Warncliffe Park, and around Rotherham. Here haunted of yore the fabulous dragon of Wantley. Here were fought many of the most desperate battles during the civil wars of the Roses. And here also flourished in ancient times those bands of gallant outlaws whose deeds have been rendered so popular in English song. The fact that both we and Scott's original readership could tie some of these locations and myths to real-world historical England doesn't mitigate the readerly experience that emerges, which is of a world being created, not necessarily a world being discovered. Such being our chief scene, the date of our story refers to the period towards the end of the reign of Richard I, when his return from his long captivity had become an event rather wished than hoped by his despairing subjects, who were in the meantime subjected to every species of subordinate oppression. The nobles, whose power had become exorbitant during the reign of Stephen, et cetera, et cetera. And he describes kind of social and political structure of this period of English history. So the narrator then can describe the physical, this district of Merry England, and the temporal, the end of the reign of Richard I. The narrator has access to the social structures of this society. He can comment on what has shaped it, etc. This continues for a few pages, but then the narrative voice becomes a bit more conscious. This state of things, I have thought it necessary to premise for the information of the general reader, who might be apt to forget that although no great historical events, such as war or insurrection, mark the existence of the Anglo-Saxons as a separate people subsequent to the reign of William II, yet the great national distinctions betwixt them and their conquerors, the recollection of what they had formerly been, and to what they were now reduced, continued down to the reign of Edward III, to keep open the wounds which the conquest had inflicted, and to maintain a line of separation betwixt the descendants of the victor Normans and the vanquished Saxons. Here we are still in a general historical, even non-fictional perspective. If we had just seen these opening paragraphs, we might not know we were reading historical fiction. We would need the title page announcing Ivanhoe as a romance. It's only here that we finally seg into fiction proper. The sun was setting upon one of the rich grassy glades of that forest, which we have mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Hundreds of broad-headed, short-stemmed, wide-branched oaks, which had witnessed perhaps the stately march of the Roman soldiery, flung their gnarled arms over a thick carpet of the most delicious green sward. And here we get this smooth transition from this big picture, almost non-fictional history, into the historical world he has created. Now the sun was setting. Now we're in one specific moment in time upon one of the rich glassy glades of the forest. Now we're in a specific place on the globe. Here the narrative proper has begun. We've transitioned from nonfiction into fiction, historical fiction, of course, right? But we zoom into the world, the historical world that Scott has built for us, the world that he has created. So what's the relationship between this opening, what sounds like nonfiction, and the narrative proper? It works, it coheres because it's one of continuity and harmony. The world that he makes, the social, temporal, and physical world, can now be accessed in a specific way that marks the difference between fictional narrative and history. And we almost feel as if we could have gone anywhere in that large picture that he gave us. He gave us a picture of all of England. He gave us a picture of 100 years of English history. He zeroes in on one spot, but we get the feeling that we could have gone somewhere else, that the world he has created is complete. Works of narrative history never have to be specific. And Professor Sutherland, I just wrote down something that she said, that in literature, you can condense the many into one. And for Scott here, out of the many, he's looking at this one moment in English history. What's crucial is that we see the harmony established here between the opening paragraphs in this moment, because while this is now a cliche of historical fiction, it's Scott's way of creating an inhabitable world. The reader's imagination has been given the necessary context and details, and we can lose ourselves in the reading. We can fall into the world. How else does Scott pull this off? How does he create this world? I think he exploits what Roland Barthes calls realist indices of realist fiction. Details in the narrative serve as believability. If a building is described as 3 stories high, it's not always symbolic. It's not always important that it is 3 as opposed to 2. The very arbitrariness of the numbers or the colors of such details, Barthes argues, makes for creditable narratives. Scott then, in realism throughout the 19th century, will specialize in creditable narratives, not because of the plausibility of the plot. There's often too many coincidences and happy endings in Victorian fiction for that. But these realist indices induce trust in the reader because we accept the world that we are given. Such details are a gift to a game designer or a film director, because the same dynamic holds in gaming, whereby the specificity of the created world makes that world inhabitable. And in kind of these groundbreaking video games like Grand Theft Auto, the arbitrary differences between city blocks made it feel real. The details weren't there symbolically. They were there to make it feel like this world was creditable. It's for that reason that Ivanhoe is such a useful text for creating 3D gaming worlds. Not because of the plot, especially because of the characters. And so I want to kind of look even more specifically at this kind of dinky video game from 1986, because 2 things you can do in the game, and remember, this is 1986, there's not a lot you can do, but the 2 things you can do are you can joust and you can lay siege to a castle. Here is the joust, and watch how image and text can interact here. On the verge of a wood, which approached to within a mile of the town of Ashby, was an extensive meadow of the finest and most beautiful green turf, surrounded on one side by the forest and fringed on the other by straggling oak trees, some of which had grown to an immense size. The ground, as if fashioned on purpose for the martial display which was intended, sloped gradually down on all sides to a level bottom, which was enclosed for the lists with strong palisades, forming a space of 1/4 of a mile in length and about 1/2 as broad. The form of the enclosure was an oblong square, save that the corners were considerably rounded off in order to afford more convenience for the spectators. And he continues, on a platform beyond the southern entrance, formed by a natural elevation of the ground, were pitched 5 magnificent pavilions, adorned with pendants of russet and black, the chosen colors of the 5 knights challengers. The cords of the tents were of the same color. So here the game designer, as I think we can see in this exact image, has everything they need to get to work. They're limited only by the technology available. The joust in Ivanhoe is a setting, but it's also an action. And at one point, the disinherited knight, who turns out to be Ivanhoe himself, is jousting against the Normans, against Philip Malvoisin. And that's what we see here. And I hope the technology works here, because I think we can see. Yeah, there he goes. In the stranger's third encounter with Sir Philip Malvoisin, he was equally successful, striking that baron so forcibly on the casque that the laces of the helmet broke, and Malvoisin, only saved from falling by being unhelmeted, was declared vanquished like his companions. So the game lets you slip easily into scenes like this. It's an easily inhabitable passage of prose. I mentioned the siege. In Defender of the Crown, you can fight against the Normans. You can siege their castles. This is what a Norman castle looks like. And I am entirely convinced that this exact passage of Ivanhoe was used to generate this image. It was a fortress of no great size, consisting of a donjon or a large and high square tower, surrounded by buildings of inferior height, which were encircled by the inner courtyard. Around the exterior wall was a deep moat, supplied with water from a neighboring rivulet. Trondebuff, whose character placed him often at feud with his enemies, had made considerable additions to the strength of his castle by building towers upon the outward wall, so as to flank it at every angle. The access, as usual in castles of the period, lay through an arched barbican or outwork, which was terminated and defended by a small turret at each corner. So this is the Norman castle. I think almost every sentence in this passage has been used to generate this picture. Now, this is the Norman castle. It's brutal, it's functional. But here's what it looks like. If you turn against your Saxon brothers and you attack one of their castles, you lay siege to one of their castles. There are few more beautiful or striking scenes in England, Scott writes, than are presented by the vicinity of this ancient Saxon fortress. The wall is of immense thickness and is properly defended by 6 huge external buttresses, which project from the circle and rise up against the sides of the tower as if to strengthen or support it. These massive buttresses are solid when they arise from the foundation and a good way higher up, but are hollowed out toward the top and terminate in a sort of turrets, communicating with the interior of the keep itself. So I think what I'm interested in is how Scott has created this inhabitable historical world. What's clear is how internally, within the novel, his historical narratives generate their own plausible rules and protocols. This world makes a kind of sense internally, as in science fiction or fantasy. As in the game, then, we don't judge it based on its realism, based on its fidelity to reality, but rather by its internal logic. We accept the world, we enter into it, we get immersed in it. It's a very different situation when we turn to modernist authors and historical narrative. I would love to show you a video game based on Mrs. Dalloway, but of course there is no such game, although someone did make a video game of The Great Gatsby. So I shouldn't say that modern novels are not adaptable to video gaming. I should maybe say they're not profitable. I don't think this Great Gatsby was selling many copies. It's hard to imagine video games based on fictional novels of the modernist period for the same reason that modernist novels have not generally succeeded in film or television, with a few exceptions. But if you compare Austen and Dickens, for example, on the screen with Virginia Woolf on the screen, it's clear that something's very resistant to the transfer into other media. Partly this is the modernists focused on interiority and subjectivity, but also the way in which modernist novels turn inwards on the form of the novel itself, the self-consciousness, the focus on language. These things are hard to translate across media. The moderns seem resistant to the labor then of creating other worlds. And Scott then, I think, is a useful way to test these modernist authors for their relationship to world building. But Scott's reputation, as many of you may know, fared quite badly in the early 20th century. Here's Ian Forster writing about Scott and aspects of the novel. Scott is a novelist over whom we shall violently divide. For my own part, I do not care for him, and find it difficult to understand his continued reputation. When we fish him out of the river of time and set him to write in that circular room with the other novelists, he presents a less impressive figure. He is seen to have a trivial mind and a heavy style. Ouch. Ford Maddox Ford was equally scathing. He had a low opinion of Sir Walter Scott, Baron, Knight of the Shire, Custos Rhodolorum, and Sheriff of some county that we cannot call to mind. In his novel No Enemy, he states that while reading What Maisie Knew, I was engrossed as any schoolboy reading Ivanhoe in the twilight, suggesting that Scott is for children, Henry James is for adults. And this is a view shared with Henry James himself, who thought Scott's novels were only for children. In The March of Literature, written towards the end of Ford's life, he dismisses the good sheriff. He writes, as you can see here, it is impossible to believe that Scott lives anywhere today. He might perhaps in a doctor's dining room in Marseille or Tarascon, or in a children's nursery in Buenos Aires. But his guilelessness is such that it is impossible to believe that any grown man could take seriously the adventures of Ivanhoe or Rob Roy. His literary merits are almost undiscoverable. And finally, he writes that the public has done for good with the slipshod methods of amateur literary hacks like Scott. Yet Ford owes Scott a few unacknowledged debts. First, for just creating the blueprint of the historical novel that Ford tweaks but does not quite revolutionize. While Ford is best known for The Good Soldier and Parade's End, both set contemporaneously, his early successes in the Edwardian period were mostly historical novels, as you can see here. He explored medieval England in The Young Lavelle and Lady Susan's Bright Eyes, The Age of Exploration in The Half Moon, and his biggest success, the English Renaissance in the Fifth Queen trilogy, made up of these three novels, The Fifth Queen, Privy Seal, and The Fifth Queen Crown. Because of Hilary Mantel's historical novels, The Fifth Queen is being kind of looked at again with new interest. These novels center around Kathryn Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, the fifth queen, who desires to see the restoration of the Catholic Church, but is in the end of the novel beheaded for her supposed sexual infidelities to the king. Ford originally wanted to write a history of Henry VIII, a nonfiction work of history, but someone else published one halfway through Ford's research. So he put his work in the library to good use with his fiction. Yet reading The Fifth Queen, we begin to think that histories and historical chronicles were not his primary sources, but rather the paintings of Hans Holbein. Ford had written a monograph on Holbein just before composing The Fifth Queen, so it's very clear he's got these on the brain. If Scott's works can be easily translated into images of gaming, as we saw, Ford's work in reverse. They are the result of the translation of images into language. He's using painting as his primary source for the Tudor court. So The Fifth Queen then represents, literally, images of the Tudor court via a striking series of tableaus that eschew the predominant realist tropes and narrative techniques of the Edwardian period. This is a portrait that at the time Ford's writing was thought to be of Kathryn. It's now not thought to be that anymore, but for Ford, this was the face of Kathryn Howard. As I bring in this quote, again, want the interaction of image and text. The lady stood rigid and straight, her hands clasped before her, her face pale so that not even a touch of red showed above the cheekbones, and hardly any in the tightly pursed lips, was as if framed in her black hood that fastened beneath the chin. The high, narrow forehead had the hair tightly drawn back so that none was visible, and the coif that showed beneath the hood was white like a nun's. The temples were hollowed so that she looked careworn inexpressively, and her lips had hard lines around them. Above her head, all sounds in that dim room seemed to whisper for a long time among the rafters, as if here dwelt something mysterious, sepulchral, a great grief or a great passion. As you can see here, Ford's language in The Fifth Queen is strikingly visual. One critic, Angus Wren, writes that in an important sense, representation, Holbein's work here becomes, in the absence of the extensive printed and photographic records available to later periods, the primary stuff of the fictional account, the reality to which a realist or naturalist author would refer. The result is not, as in Walter Scott's novels, an inhabitable world. If this doesn't feel three-dimensional, that's because it's based on flat paintings. So The Fifth Queen then looks to a different tradition. It looks to Flaubert and the French tradition, one that becomes an alternative to Scott and subsequent British novels that get called realist and that emerges throughout the Victorian period. Instead of valuing them as kind of realism, Ford's modernist works of historical fiction reproduce the mimetic process itself, representing or representing the Tudor court. The novels then don't try to be a window onto the past. Instead, they are linguistic versions of paintings or pictures of the past. And like modernist painting, like Cézanne or Picasso, it values flatness over transparency. So if the modernist historical novel is radically different from Scott, it might reside in just this phenomenon. Yet Ford and the moderns, I think in general, protest too much when they disparage Scott so quickly, because in fact, Scott's DNA is all over Ford's historical fiction in other ways. And here I'm kind of overlapping with Professor Sutherland's talk just a bit, because Scott, as we know, liked to pair cultures that Raymond Williams would later call residual or emergent. And this is very schematic, right? But here we see embodied, this is what drew Lukács, right? George Lukács to Scott, what he termed these historical social types. And the Highlands and Saxon culture is residually embodied in Fergus MacIvor and Cedric of Rotherwood. Again, like Professor Sutherland said, in these novels, the many are kind of conveyed via the one. And then we get emergent culture in the Lowlands and Norman culture, emergent, maybe even dominant, embodied in Bradwardine and Richard Lionhearted. Again, this is partly what drew Lukács to Scott, right? He writes that Scott always represents social trends and historical forces socially and not individually. Ford relies heavily on this strategy, not just in his historical fiction like The Fifth Queen, where Kathryn Howard is the residual romanticized and idealized figure of English Catholicism, and Ford was Catholic, pitted against the cold Protestantism of the emergent Cromwell, but also in Parade's End, Ford's great epic of the Great War, whose protagonist, Christopher Hitchens, is by his own admission stuck in his favorite century, the 18th century, and is undone in the first novel by his supposed friend McMaster, who signals the emergent upwardly mobile middle classes. So while Ford's stylistic practices are safely removed from Scott's aesthetic, their underlying vision of history and the writing of history chimes with Scott to a degree that Ford would hate to acknowledge. Virginia Woolf, by contrast, acknowledged her debts to Scott much more openly and warmly. Many readers who have only read To the Lighthouse in terms of Woolf and Scott might assume that Woolf is very dismissive of him. Here's an early scene in To the Lighthouse. For Charles Tansley had been saying, she looked up as if she expected to hear the crash of books on the floor above, had been saying that people don't read Scott anymore. Then her husband thought, that's what they'll say of me. And so he went and got one of those books. And if he came to the conclusion that's true, what Charles Tansley said, he would accept it about Scott. She could see that he was weighing, considering, putting this with that as he read. Here, Mr. Ramsay, the father figure, is worried that Scott won't hold up this time through. And that if Scott doesn't hold up, then he himself, Mr. Ramsay, will not hold up either. He will be forgotten, just like Scott will be forgotten. So Mr. Ramsay reads Scott anxiously. He returns to Scott anxiously, worried that it's not going to hold up in this reading. But not to worry. He reads Scott and he says, well, let them improve upon that, he thought, as he finished the chapter. He felt that he had been arguing with somebody and had got the better of him. They could not improve upon that, whatever they might say, and his own position became more secure. The lovers were fiddlesticks, he thought, collecting it all in his mind again. That's fiddlesticks, that's first rate, he thought, putting one thing beside another. But he must read it again. He could not remember the whole shape of the thing. He had to keep his judgment in suspense. So he returned to the other thought. If young men did not care for this naturally, they did not care for him either. Why not to complain, thought Mr. Ramsay, trying to stifle his desire to complain to his wife that young men did not admire him. But he was determined. He would not bother her again. Here he looked at her reading. She looked very peaceful reading. He liked to think that everyone had taken themselves off and that he and she were alone. The whole of life did not consist in going to bed with a woman, he thought, returning to Scott and Balzac, to the English novel and the French novel. Even though Scott holds up in Mr. Ramsay's reading, in a novel all about perspective, this is only Mr. Ramsay's view. And as the novel shifts away from him and his patriarchal neuroses towards the amateur but modernist painter Lily Briscoe, many readers might also see the novel as similarly dismissing Scott, trying to move away from him. Yet Woolf's critical writings, again, show a warm appreciation for Scott. And partly this is because of her biographical immersion in his works. Her father, Leslie Stephen, the model for Mr. Ramsay, read and the brothers every night, like literally every night. And when they had finished all of Scott, they would start over again. They would go back to Waverley and just kind of keep doing this. They would just kind of keep cycling through every evening with Sir Walter Scott, almost in the way we can binge watch television. So in a sense, Woolf was kind of lived and breathed Walter Scott. Her collected essays then, mostly reviews, reference him continually and usually positively. She compares him with Austen in 1918. She wrote that Scott was the master of the large method, but Jane Austen was mistress of the small. Comparing him to Robert Louis Stevenson, here's 1929. While she says, Scott repels our taste in 1,000 ways, but the crisis, that is the point where the accent falls and shapes the book under it, is right. Slouching, careless as he is, he will at the critical moment pull himself together and strike the one stroke needed, the stroke which gives the book its vividness in memory. She always kind of rescues him from harsh readings. One major thread of her writings, however, does chime with how she stages him into the lighthouse, because a common refrain in her evaluations of Scott are how people around her don't consider him relevant anymore. The Scottish novels, she writes, rank among the permanently great, which are nonetheless great because they have ceased to influence the living. Scott, for Woolf, is great but remote to the point of not relevant. And in a review of one of his novels, she writes, there are some writers who have entirely ceased to influence others, whose fame is for that reason both serene and cloudless, who are enjoyed or neglected rather than criticized or read. Among them is Scott. Just before her death, she reviewed an edition of Scott's journals, writing of his novels. There they remain, completely accepted entirely rejected. That's why he's the perfect reading for Mr. Ramsay, because the novel can express some admiration for many of Mr. Ramsay's gifts and qualities, while also signaling the need for him to make way for figures like the painter Lily Briscoe. And if Lukács and Ford focused on Scott's juxtaposition of conflicting cultures at historical junctures, Woolf would observe but reject his embodiment of historical forces in great men, these historical social types, as Lukács called them, the great man theory of history formalized by Carlyle and obviously staged in Scott with male figures like Richard the Lionhearted. Yet Woolf doesn't generally use Scott as a foil to her feminist historiography, partly because the 19th century provided enough targets for her sharp critiques, including her father, but also Carlyle. Instead, Woolf historicized her own reading of Scott. She saw Scott as part of an era that held firm beliefs, however arbitrary or however remote from her period. And while at some periods Woolf launched revolutionary critiques of the 19th century in the realist tradition, at other times she yearned for the social certainties that gave rise to such a tradition. And so the pendulum kind of swings back and forth in her works, her critical works, between admiration for the tradition and frustration at what the tradition does not allow her. The most famous critique of the tradition is her seminal essay, Modern Fiction, from 1919, where she attacks what she calls the materialists, John Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, who rotely deploy Victorian modes. She champions a new impressionist aesthetic, famously writing here, examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. And as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from of old. The moment of importance came not here, but there. So that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his own feeling and not upon convention, there would be no plot, no comedy, no tragedy, no love interest or catastrophe in the accepted style. And so she says, let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness. In all of literary history, it's hard to find an essay more influential than this one. She shapes the modernist canon. She discards established figures in ways that still dominate college syllabi and research. Yet, just a few years later, she's writing Mrs. Dalloway. She's collecting a bunch of her essays into the collection, the volume of essays called The Common Reader, which goes from Chaucer up to the present. Here she includes a slightly revised version of this essay halfway through the book. But the book concludes with an essay called How It Strikes a Contemporary. And now in 1925, she looks around and she is not impressed. There is none of the generational confidence of this earlier essay. Instead, she now praises the Romantics. She's envious of how Scott, Wordsworth, and Austen possess what she calls the power of their belief, their conviction that imposes itself upon us. Her contemporaries, by contrast, seem trapped in the very impressionism she had earlier championed. So then our contemporaries afflict us because they have ceased to believe. The most sincere of them will only tell us what it is that happens to himself. They cannot make a world because they are not free of other human beings. They cannot tell stories because they do not believe that stories are true. They cannot generalize. So they cannot make a world. So Scott could make a world. To believe that your impressions hold good for others is to be released from the cramp and confinement of personality. It is to be free as Scott was free, to explore with a vigor which still holds a spellbound the whole world of adventure and romance. Scott's worlds are convincing, then, she argues, because he believed that his impressions held good for others. He can make a world. He can make it so complete video game designers 200 years later can pick up his ideas and easily go to work. While Woolf, then, could envy Austen and Scott their convictions, she could never force herself to share them. Woolf's novels, then, her fiction, depicts a world in flux, chaotic, not seemingly bound by laws like we see in Ivanhoe. This is kind of most quickly illustrated in her breakthrough short story, The Mark on the Wall, where she says, but how dull this is, this historical fiction. Instead, in that story, a woman looks on a mark on the wall from across the room and tries to figure out what it is. That's the entire story. She goes on this epic mental journey through her mind, 5 pages of mostly stream of consciousness prose. At the end, her husband says, oh, it's a snail. Even a simple wall is unstably constructed or built. The world of this wall is indeterminate until the very end. We're not sure of anything. Nothing in this world is reliable. As in the essay Modern Fiction, she records the atoms as they fall upon the narrator's consciousness in this impressionist modernist narrative. While the world she makes then in Mark on the Wall, Mrs. Dalloway to the Lighthouse, her great works of the 1920s, the worlds she makes, the worlds that she builds are chaotic. Its laws are hard to make out because it is her contemporary world. However, Woolf, and this is, I think, the major distinction between Woolf and Scott, is that she imposes strict formal designs on her work. The novels are highly structured to make up for the chaos of the world. That's the modernist exchange, we might say. She's not promising us a world that makes sense or has any design consistency. Instead, she'll give us a novel with sense and design consistency. Into the Lighthouse, if Woolf is using Scott to chart the transition from Mr. Ramsay to figures like the painter Lily Briscoe, which incidentally might be her own vision of Highland to Lowland, Saxon to Norman, we can see then in the design of the novel how she represents this transition. The novel is divided into three parts, three chapters. They're called The Window, Time Passes, in the Lighthouse. There are a few windows in the first part. Young James looks through them, wanting to go to the lighthouse. So there's the window. In Michael Levison's influential reading of Rectangles in the novel, the first part, taking place before the Great War, is animated by the window as a metaphor. He calls it the truth of being, which Levinson reads this first section as a comment on Victorian realism. And I think we can extend it back to Scott himself. But it clouds over in the second part to become the mirror of Time Passes, what he calls the truth of seeming. And he reads this as commenting on James and early Impressionism, Conrad, I would add Ford. But the mirror cracks in this famous passage here. Did nature supplement what man advanced? Did she complete what he began? That dream of sharing, completing, of finding in solitude on that beach an answer was then but a reflection in a mirror. And the mirror itself was but the surface glassiness which forms in quiescence when the nobler powers sleep beneath. To pace the beach was impossible. Contemplation was unendurable. The mirror was broken. If we see the Impressionists and his late Romantics, this passage we could see as announcing, in a sense, the death of Romanticism because of the Great War. The desire to fuse with nature has been shattered. The mirror is broken. We are left then in the final section with our final rectangle. Here is Lily Briscoe's painting. Quickly, as if she were, and this is the final paragraph of the novel, quickly as if she were recalled by something over there, she turned to her canvas. There it was, her picture. Yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. It would be hung in the attic, she thought. It would be destroyed. But what did that matter, she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps. They were empty. She looked at her canvas. It was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue. I have had my vision. We can call this high modernism, whatever term we want. And Woolf was channeling her sister very much, Vanessa Bell. In contrast to Ford's representations of Holbein's paintings, Woolf's novel is itself the painting, at least metaphorically or even allegorically. What kind of world, then, is she building? She's building the world of artistic production, quite literally, because the heroic act of part 3 is the making of a painting. Instead of world building with its own laws and codes that Scott was so good at, that Mr. Ramsay admires so much, Woolf has Lily Briscoe transform the world that she sees, into the world of art that has its own laws. And while Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse take place in the present, and we're not even getting into Woolf's later interest in history and historical fiction with novels like Orlando and the Years, even just in her 20s novels that take place very much in the present. The present itself is historicized for Woolf, even as the novel thinks about how the world is transformed into an aesthetic object. And this is the last quote I'll bring in. This is, again, in the third section, through Lily's perspective, as she's making her painting. Here on the grass on the ground, she thought, sitting down and examining with her brush a little colony of plantains. For the lawn was very rough. Here sitting on the world, she thought, for she could not shake herself free from the sense that everything this morning was happening for the first time, perhaps for the last time. As a traveler, even though he's half asleep, knows, looking out of the train window, that he must look now, for he will never see that town or that mule cart or that woman at work in the fields again. The lawn was the world, and they were up here together on this exalted station, she thought, looking at old Mr. Carmichael, who seemed, though they had not said a word all this time, to share her thoughts. So the lawn was the world, but there is the canvas, the soon-to-be finished picture. If for Scott and Ivanhoe, the world he builds is an historical one, that of Willie Briscoe, and by extension Virginia Woolf herself, is the world of time. Everything we see perhaps for the last time. So whatever world we build out of the present recedes into the past in Woolf's novel. All fiction, then, is historical fiction. In that sense, the historical novel is exactly what binds and divides Woolf and the modernists from Walter Scott. Thank you.
I have been talking in silence. I have been silenced. Like the Highlanders. I'm sorry for the joke. Well, we both talk, although focusing on different aspects and trying to see more or less sort of continuity and projection of, how should I put it, of Scott's fictional strategies and techniques to modernism up to the present in both of your talks. I'd like to start our discussion by posing a question for both of you, actually trying to more or less bring both of your presentations together and trying to see their continuities. Can we say that world making in Scott's novels, and think especially about Waverley, is ostensibly derived from and inscribed in place? Aren't the Highlands on the one hand and the lowlands and the border on the other hand geographically, culturally, and historically severed? You say that, Professor O'Malley, you said very convincingly that Scott builds as a sort of world builder, but is just in his novels, is there just one world, or are there two worlds that coexist? Isn't the world of modern lowland and English civilization, for instance, forcing itself over the world of the Highlands, and which eventually, as Professor Sutherland so beautifully described, will be effaced after experiencing such horrendous violence and the Highland clearances after the 45. So is that just is Scott, or are Scott's novels or do Scott's novels engender a single world, or do they engender worlds that coexist and eventually clash?
Well, yeah, Professor Sutherland, if you don't mind me answering first, I'm thinking of, for Lukács as a Marxist critic, the Marxist vision of history is exactly that clash of worlds, right? Marx predicted the end of history once there was an end of class conflict. So the class conflicts that Scott stages in his fiction are history itself. So if we think of worlds in relation to history, we could say, yeah, Highland is a separate world from the lowland. And yet in a fictional sense, it is still one world, only because the narrative of Ivanhoe or of Waverley, that conflict is the world. That kind of is the world that is created. He could have made it a three-part conflict, right? He's choosing two. He makes it look obvious, right? Oh, of course, Highland versus lowland. Mm-hmm. But as many historical critics have said, especially in Ivanhoe, the way he stages Saxon versus Norman is kind of his own romantic invention. And so in that sense, it is Scott's world. It's not multiple worlds. It's really Scott's world that he has made.
Professor Sutherland, please. Do you want to comment on that? Your microphone, please.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, it's not muted.
No, it's not anymore. It's not anymore. I think that Beatrix unmuted you.
Yeah, I think it's Beatrix is the mastermind behind this. She's the world builder for us, isn't she? I think the thing about Scott is that he does build a world, but he builds into it the negative and the positive. I mean, it is a world in which possession and dispossession are happening at the same time. So in a sense, they're not two separate worlds. They're just worlds with, a negative and a positive pole, as it were, within them. And it's about the world that he asks us to enter and actually to consent to is a world in which many are dispossessed in order for the few to possess. And to a large extent, I think we go along with that.
I see. Well, thank you. I was just, I have multiple questions here, and I invite the viewers to pose their questions as well. I have a question to Professor Sutherland. You demonstrated very beautifully how one can trace sort of continuities of Scott's historical novel, of the sort of genre of historical novel that is closely associated to Scott in contemporary historical fiction by women. I'm totally ignorant about this, but I was wondering whether those new historical novelists, do they pick up examples, narrative strategies from women novelists that preceded Scott and that represented crucial or major historical moments, such as Jane Porter, such as Maura Edgeworth, and even Frances Burney? Or is Scott perceived nowadays as a sort of only matrix for the creation and writing of new historical fiction? I'm thinking especially about Maura Edgeworth's Castle Rackrent, which is a sort of historical novel, as it's set 20 years before the Union, and it is a very self-reflexive novel which is focused on a first person, which has a sort of first-person narrator when we see things through his eyes. I think we can hear echoes of this in
if you think the historical novel, in a sense, is a public novel, it's a novel to some extent about public situations and public events, then Castle Rackrent does kind of fit into that, because it's the public impacting on certain kind of regional and private worlds, perhaps. So in that sense, a historical novel. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the historical novel before Scott, there are some interesting examples. There's the example of Harriet Lee, isn't there, who writes about Mary Stuart. And she imagines Mary, Queen of Scots, she imagines a birth of 2 children to Mary, Queen of Scots, twin daughters. And she spins from that a kind of fantasy history. It's a conjectural history that's purely speculative. Scott is not really in that world, but you could say that some of the recent historical writers and some of the female historical writers have taken up some aspects of that, in that they are looking back. And because many women historical writers are very much aware that women are very limited in their representation in history, either in fictional history or in real history, they're looking back and they're seeing history as a kind of mutilated knowledge. So how do you, as it were, put into the past what didn't actually exist or appeared not to exist in the past? So, there's a kind of continuity to some extent in the use of certain kind of fantasy elements, I think, rather than anything else. The other thing, I think, where there's a continuity is with women writers of the modernist period, actually, but we wouldn't necessarily think of as modernists. And I'm thinking of around the First World War, just after the First World War, there was a real explosion of women's history writing, both in fiction and in the main discourse, the main discipline of history. And much of it was concerned with what at a later period, not until the 1950s, when men entered the field. It was then given a name, and it was usually ascribed to the men. And it was ascribed to men like Christopher Hill and Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson, and it was called History from Below. But these women were writing it much earlier. So women like Nora Lofts, who was a novelist, Eileen Powers, who wrote Medieval Women, who was looking at, she was looking at a whole range of possibilities, ways of opening up history to include those who had been absent from it. So women and also the lower levels of society. And I think lots of those impact now on the modern woman's historical novel. Writers like Helen Dunmore, who died quite recently, but she is looking at, I mentioned her novel, The Siege. She looks at the siege of Leningrad, and she includes in it so many vignettes of characters who are just very ordinary people in the street. And suddenly they interrupt the narrative of the main family that you're following through it. And suddenly you become caught up in the life of this person in the street who you might just meet for 2 paragraphs. And it's just maybe a woman who is standing in a doorway, but she is trying to cope with her present situation, just standing in that doorway, responding to the immediate events around her. You know, perhaps it's a bomb about to drop or something like that, or she has a bundle. In one of these paragraphs, it's a woman with a bundle of clothing, and she is trying to get to a train that she has been told will take her out of the city, but she's too weak to carry her bundle. And you concentrate on that, and a different kind of view of history opens up. History that you don't normally see. It is history from below. And I think lots of the women who are writing now are kind of including that. So, I mean, Scott does build a world, doesn't he? But it's a world from which an awful lot is excluded. And the whole effect and the power of world building is that you don't notice what's excluded. That's what makes world building effective. And these women writers, I think, are drawing on older traditions sometimes to compensate from that, to make history less mutilated.
Do you want to comment on that, Professor O'Malley, please?
Oh, just briefly. Yeah, that was lovely. But just briefly, with Virginia Woolf, her interest in writing lives from below was a very, very conscious thing on her part. And in fact, when she looked back at women writers of the 19th century, Austen, George Eliot, she would often have a kind of qualified admiration. Kind of, there's always like a fly in the ointment there. So her treatment of literary history, kind of women's literary history, was fraught. But her treatment of what she thought of as feminist historiography was always like a full-throated yes to kind of recovering the lives, these forgotten lives. And so one of her favorite genres was simply women's memoir, kind of women who had written of their lives, or even their diaries. She was just constantly reviewing and reading all these. And so she had better things to say about those than she did about, you know, Daniel Deronda or these kind of great 19th century novels.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I didn't perhaps say what you wanted me to say about Castle Rackrent. I suppose what's so powerful about Castle Rackrent is, I think, a much more convincing use of dialect.
Yes,
I didn't agree with what Ian Duncan said yesterday about Scott's dialect. I mean, his use of Gaelic he makes the Gaelic speakers sound subnormal. I mean, it's so phony. It's, you know, and even in its time, it was recognised as phony. So I think his Gaelic range, his range of dialect is pretty limited, and it's often quite theatricalised. But I think Castle Rackrent's more convincing. It's also very convincing on domestic history.
Yes, but I was thinking as well, because it is, you know, the story is premised on a first-person narrator, and this, to a large extent, inflects the entire narrative with a sort of projected subjective of the narrator, Thady, and I think that this is something that resonates with us, especially with Hilary Mantel, in which we have the sort of Cromwell's perspective, in which we have the sort of the perspective of one character, of one narrator, more or less filtering all the historical experience. And I think with Scott we tend to have this sort of very detached narrator that sees the unfolding of historical events as something which is rather distant, not experienced as a sort of first-hand.
But Mantle doesn't quite do that. We don't see things through Cromwell's eyes. We're kind of standing at his shoulder.
Yeah, really great here.
Yeah. It's kind of oblique. I think what she does is really quite extraordinary because it's oblique. So we're kind of with him and not with him.
Yes.
It's not the same as, looking through his eyes exactly. And there are whole sections, aren't there? Those purple passages that she goes into, a bit like Shakespeare's riffs on history that you get in the history plays of Shakespeare, where suddenly you have these great purple passages where you're talking about, almost about England as the sceptred isle. It's quite an extraordinary double voice that she has, I think, in the Cromwell trilogy.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Professor O'Malley, do you?
Oh, just when you say Castle Rackrent, I just finished a book on Irish literary history, and Scott is so huge for Irish culture.
Yeah.
Especially not just Waverley, but Ivanhoe too. The way in Ivanhoe, the Saxons feel displaced by the Normans, almost writes the script for late 19th century Irish nationalism. Whereas Castle Rackrent is kind of actual native-born Irish narrative, which might have a few wiser things to say about the interaction between kind of native and Anglo. The way it uses these voices is it creates this other tradition.
I think as well, to dealing with some of the compositional elements of word making, you just said it has lots of narrative inefficiencies. One of the ways in which Scott more or less tries to struggle with those narrative inefficiencies is by polyphony, by heteroglossia, by presenting this multiple, diverse world through linguistic and dialectical modulations, I guess. And I think this is something that he probably has learned from Edgeworth, I guess.
From
Edgeworth, from our Edgeworth.
I mean, the joust scene, just because it's fresh in my mind, the joust scene in Ashby, in Ivanhoe. Yeah, there is jousting, right? But most of the action of the narrative is in the stands, kind of all the tensions between Ivan of York and Richard's brother, right? So there's all sorts of like a stratification there of society.
And which is linguistically inscribed, in which you see the stratification through linguistic and stylistic and dialectical modulation or vernacular modulation, I guess.
Yeah. Which I think is why he feels like he needs these Jewish characters, right? He needs to offset English culture. If English culture is bifurcated Norman Saxon, how could it possibly cohere? Well, it could cohere if we have this other, right? There's some other thing that they expel at the end, like Rebecca of York leaves, she has to leave. It's one of the surprising things in that novel, I think, is like she just leaves, like she just voluntarily expelled herself from England. It's almost like Scott is making me say, I have to leave England Christian and Gentile so that it can cohere itself. They can work out their differences. Yeah.
But I think as well, what I talked about is the sedimentary layers of a Scott narrative. I think, that works as well. You may have the dialect and as you say, the different linguistic registers, but you also have the different levels of storytelling built into a Scott novel. So, very often you do have a kind of ballad origin. And sometimes there's a mad character in his novels, isn't there, who sings a song, and you realize in retrospect that song kind of anticipates what the prose narrative will eventually get to, but it's buried deep in the novel, and it represents a kind of earlier form of storytelling, an early form of history telling that may be more compressed, maybe more anticipatory of what's to come. And he builds up the levels. He'll have documentation, and he will have history that stands outside the story as well as inside the story, and that does in a sense future-proof a lot of what he says. because it is a kind of defense mechanism around this world that he builds, so that, you know, I might attack it from one side and say, you know, such and such happens, and, you know, this is not represented, but actually there's another level of story that allows you to say, well, no, maybe it's looked at another way. You can see it in there.
So by being very layered, it is also very perceived as stable, or presented as being stable, or
well, no, actually unstable. I would say it's unstable,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's its survival mechanism in a way.
I see.
You can pull out different layers at different points.
I see. Well, we have a question from the public, by Beatrix actually, and she's saying that when one reads Castle Rackrent after reading, when one reads Castle Rackrent after reading Waverley and Scott's gratitude to her novel, they seem to very distinct and very different. How do you perceive Edgeworth's impact on Scott in Waverley?
No, I agree. I think they're very different. I mean, I can't quite see it myself. Scott himself, and when he reviewed Emma, Jane Austen's novel Emma, he wrote a review in the Quarterly Review in 1816. So, you know, his own career as a novelist was well underway, and he actually described Edgeworth and Jane Austen as working in a similar way, which he says is quite different from mine. He says that they're looking at ordinary events and ordinary people in ordinary situations. And in fact, he said so much so that you almost can't tell they're writing novels at all. Whereas he says, I'm doing something very different. And I think there's a certain amount of truth in that.
Can I add like something, because I asked the question? So
please,
like,
you are the world builder. So.
Yeah, I'm here. So well, because I read Waverley, and I knew that there was this whole connection to Castle Rackrent, but then it was so much more meaningful when you read sort of his preface that is in the last chapter, sort of, and he says, like, word by word, quoting Castle Rackrent and Edgeworth, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, it's going to be like, there's going to have so many similarities and stuff. And when I got the book, first of all, I was like, well, it's like an eighth of Waverley. So how did you get from reading Castle Rackrent to creating Waverley? And I was just so I was like, how did he do it? Or how do you see sort of Edgeworth's contribution to Waverley? Because other than the whole aspect of putting light to things and people and a way of living that wasn't really being shown and being displayed, other than that, I'm very, like, it's difficult for me to see something else that he might have gotten from Castle Rackrent other than that. That's why I asked the question, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one way, formally, I'm not sure. Like, I don't know. How does this very compact, eighth the size of Waverley novel, which doesn't have these kind of preambles and long world building sections that modern readers kind of skim through quicker. How does that inspire this kind of very loose baggy aesthetic that Scott pioneers? I'm not sure. But one thing that strikes me is, and I think this is also because I'm thinking of Rackrent as an Irish text, is that Rackrent kind of bequeaths this almost cliche of Anglo-Irish memoir, not just fiction, but memoir, where Anglo-Irish writers describe how they came in contact with it's always the people, the true people of Ireland, the Catholics, through domestic help. It was in the kitchen talking to the cook, or it was out back talking to the stable boy or something. There's some sort of access to the native culture via this close proximity that the big house forces, right? Kind of forces Irish, and Anglo-Irish together. And it might be that for Scott, looking at this friction between these two worlds and thinking about in Ivanhoe, how the Saxons have secrets. There's things that they keep secret from the Normans. The Norman vision doesn't quite have access to. And so it's different formally because again, the omniscience of Scott kind of looks at them both, and maybe we root for the Saxons, but kind of narratologically we are seeing both sides really. Whereas in Rackrent's novel, it's all about who is hiding from whom, and the Irish Catholics always have something they're not quite revealing to the Anglo-Irish, and that becomes a big feature of Anglo-Irish writing generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, in just in a much kind of simpler way, you know, I'm being less sophisticated about this, but the idea that Britain is constituted of many parts, and there Maria Edgeworth was kind of opening up an area of what was not quite Britain as yet, was not the United Kingdom, but she was opening up a world that was so close but was unknown.
Right.
She was doing that, and Scott saw the potential in that too, to bring parts of Scotland that were simply unknown to Britain into a kind of British worldview, to bring those in. There's something even anthropological about the way that it's done. But I would say that Maria Edgeworth's approach to regionalism has much more say in common with Emily Bronte in Wuthering Heights than it does to anything that Scott is doing.
I see. And to what extent? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry for sharing my curiosity. How do you see the similarities, the form?
Well, I think to some extent what Seamus is saying about these worlds of these worlds that can be very close to each other, but are actually not comprehending each other. And I mean, Emily Bronte makes amazing use of that between the two houses in Wuthering Heights, and the two ways of living within a region, but that are to some extent mutually incomprehensible. And she does a lot of it through dialect as well.
Exactly.
Thank you. It was I could see that they're doing different things, and mainly they're doing different things to different people, I guess, and to different sort of literatures. Thiago, we have a question from Professor Duncan.
Okay. I think it is directed to Professor Sutherland.
Professor Sutherland.
Yeah. Because I was rude about his use of dialect. I'm sorry.
So thanks for your wonderfully acute and subtle rereading of Waverley. Can we read any work of literature against the grain, or is there something particular about Waverley by which the novel opens itself to such a reading? This is what I took. I'm sorry, I'm short-sighted. This is what I took you to be arguing. Also, that different historical moments make different possibilities of such reading available. You gave us a vivid account of why our own moment opens up Waverley in ways that might not have been visible, say, 20 or 30 years ago, or that were not visible by the time of the Modernists, in which Professor O'Malley also described. So I'm sorry for jumping into your question, Professor Duncan.
Sorry, was the question? Is there something?
Yes.
I think yes, it's true that our moment now, as we reach the end, we've reached the end of the belief that history comes to an end. We no longer believe that. We no longer believe in the improvement narrative. We can't possibly hold on to that. So yes, I think there are readings now possible that were not possible even 30 years ago. I think that's right. But I also think, and to some extent I'm using arguments that you've used so persuasively as well, that because of the way Scott actually builds up a narrative, and it's true of Waverley, but it's true of other narratives too, he builds them up layer by layer. You have almost these geological layerings of history, you know, it's time layers, that it's possible to pull out different layers and to kind of challenge the layers one against another sometimes. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that he included Selkirk at all. I mean, he knew Selkirk. He knew that Selkirk's views of the immediate situation, never mind the past, were actually differently inflected from his own, even though they both believed in the improvement narrative. And yet he throws him in anyway. Why does he throw him in? He didn't need to throw him in at all. And it's almost as though he's either, you know, setting off little bombs to explode his own story, or he is asking us to kind of open up history to different kinds of reading. And in that sense, maybe what he is doing is future-proofing his own text. You know, saying that I know that history is mutilated knowledge. I know that. But if I include several different mutilated knowledges, maybe together, they'll create a more coherent knowledge. I don't know if that answers your question. But yes, Scott didn't know Gaelic, but he knew people who did. He knew the Clefanes, Margaret MacLean Clefane, who tried to teach him some Gaelic and in fact, he based the character of Flora McKeever upon her. Sorry, this is another of Ian Duncan's questions. He could have done a better job than he did. And I'm interested that he just didn't care enough to do it. So that he does give his very few Gaelic speakers, and he's always careful, I mean, to gloss the Gaelic, you know, so that nobody actually has to deal with it. You can just read the English translation next to it. But he makes them sound like they're sort of, you know, deviants from any kind of normal, intelligent world. I don't know why he does that.
I think, can we have time for one more question? Or does anyone from the public want to pose another question? Or are we?
You can pose your question. Do whatever you want, Thiago.
Okay, so before we efface our before our world disappears, I would like to pose a question to Professor O'Malley. I understand, of course, as you have extensively demonstrated, that by and large, modernists were rather reticent towards Scott, probably because of his huge popularity during the Victorian age. But there are some, I don't know if I can qualify this in this manner, but one of the striking elements of especially Scott's earlier novels is that they are very self-reflexive. They oftentimes they break the sort of realist code, as we don't see, for example, in Jane Austen. And I think that this might have appealed. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm just speculating to modernist sensibilities. This is we find echoes of this sort of self-reflexive narrative in many modernist novels. I think, and we see Scott doing this with this narrator who talks directly, who breaks the fourth wall many times, and is always indicating that this is a work of fiction, that this is a construct, a literary construct, not a mirror of reality.
Right. Yeah. I think that's right. I think a lot of people have talked about those affinities between the kind of pre-Victorian realism, which does value all these kind of editorial apparatuses and paraframes and paratext and everything like that, with something like Ulysses. But when Maddox Ford described Jane Austen, he said she is a pure novelist, and she is a novelist like the North Star is the North Star. Like, she is just luminous and perfect, and everything is there in the novel that you need. And if you take one word away, the entire thing falls apart. Whereas for Scott, you can skip a whole chapter and like you're fine as a reader, like you're okay. And so for Ford, I think that was what he didn't like about Scott's style, and I think for Woolf too, that's what she didn't like about him. And she found so much to like in him. She was kind of the only kind of champion of Scott I could find as a novelist in the modernist era, at least by kind of people we think of as the modernist was Woolf. But yeah, that quality of Scott's that seems to wander and ramble. I think the modernists would consider that very much like a 19th century loose baggy monster, as Henry James called it, quality of storytelling. So yeah, they're more interested in Lawrence Sterne, Tristram Shandy, because there the rambling seems directed. It seems like it's got a specific purpose to it. And I think for Scott's there's these frames and these paratexts. In a sense, he doesn't invent them; he inherits them from earlier eras. And so Austen is seen as the more innovative writer by not using the paratext, by just kind of announcing this narrator, or not even announcing the narrator. The narrator just kind of starts talking in the beginning. And so there's something formally compelling about that the modernists were, I think, drawn to. So even though Austen seems the least modernist in terms of that kind of narrative storytelling, she's also, in a sense, the purest. She's the most
yeah, that's right.
In spirit, closest in spirit.
I mean, Samuel Beckett said that Jane Austen taught him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf is the one who really made Austen's reputation in the 20th century. Right. Woolf's essays on Austen are amazing. And she saw Austen as the writer of the everyday. Yeah. You know, the thing that can't be apprehended the first time, because you always enter the everyday at a kind of interrupted moment. And she said that's how Jane Austen's novels work too. So she saw Jane Austen as a modernist.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a chapter, I think it's like chapter 15 in Emma, the first part, where plot-wise nothing happens, but it's just Emma's thoughts. And it's all in the third person. So it's this new free indirect discourse, as we now call it, that Flaubert gets credit for sometimes, but it's clearly
it's so with Austen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like watching a soliloquy of Shakespeare. It's like its thought is elevated to center stage, and so it's not that far from Woolf and Joyce and what they do. Yeah. Scott doesn't. That's not his interest, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to pose or make another comment? Professor Sutherland, Professor O'Malley, Beatrix, or
just thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed Seamus's paper very much. And I enjoyed the talks yesterday too, Ian Duncan's and yours, Diego, as well. Very much. So thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us, for being here with us at the University of São Paulo. If you were here, we would probably continue our conversation under coffee or grabbing some beer afterwards. I hope that one day this pandemic will end and we will be able to host you properly. So, and one of the things that I don't like about this distance, this format of holding conferences, is that we cannot applaud our guests. So I invite everyone who is watching us to applaud our guests. Thank you very much for your
thank you too.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Provoking thought.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Oh, thank like all three of you, honestly, because it was an honor to have you talking about Scott and about so many other authors. I mean, we say, oh, we're going to talk about Scott, and it seems so distant from us. But then here we are talking about, Mantell and Austen and Bronte and Edgeworth, and it's just, it makes you, just want to read it all again. And for someone who's just, I think that for everyone that just sometimes it's, reading again and again seems kind of tiring, and it's like, oh, I have to read it again. But I think that these sorts of conversations makes us just see the whole spark of it again. I personally wasn't thrilled to go and read Scott, but now I'm thrilled to go and read all of Scott. So, and that's all to your guys's words, and just it's from you. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see each other at another time. So,
right.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.